All right, welcome back to Happy Half Hour, our once per month chat with Toby Weber. I'm Nik Shermans, discussing markets, the lighter side of markets, headlines, politics, whatever you guys want to cover. We've certainly got no shortage of content because the last, week and a half has been pretty crazy. And I wrote a blog, Unprecedented Uncertainty, kind of making light of the fact how everyone thinks this moment is the biggest moment ever and we've never seen any of this stuff before. Then all of a sudden we get an assassination attempt on a former president, sitting president saying he's not going to run. And it's not unprecedented. So if you go back to 1968, there is some parallel, not exactly the same, but that's a long winding intro. Toby, do you have any thoughts on what's going on?
I don't. It sure seems like it's unprecedented uncertainty at the moment. So I would agree with you in that respect.
But it is not unprecedented. Well, I guess you can say it's unprecedented, but when I look at markets, which has the final say on how things are really going, I think this is the best performing election year ever. So at this point, today's July 23rd, this is the highest return year the S&P has seen during an election year. The market has not had a intra-year decline of more than 5%, right? So peak to trough down over 5%. The market has not had that in 2024. Average intra-year declines going back 80 plus years are about 10%. And the last thing I'll say is the S&P has not had a down 2% day or more in 350 plus trading days. So when you reconcile how people talk, what our clients are saying, what the media is saying, you look at markets, the markets are telling a different story.
So I'll just jump right in. How do you explain that, or do you not even attempt to explain that?
The way I explain it is politics come and go. Politics they're like a vacuum. They suck up a lot of attention, but once the election comes and goes, people move on and everyone thinks this election is the most important election ever. I'm not saying is hot political takes and investment success. Separate the two as much as we can in empirical evidence over any election cycle that you can look at, and I've looked at every one over the past 100 years. There's really no boogeyman in the bushes waiting to come out if your party does or does not win the White House. That's the fact of the matter.
Okay, that makes sense. So do you follow the politics, or do you even waste any brain power on it? Or, because you get, some people will say, hey, this, we've had a change in candidate from a week ago. What is this new candidate going to mean in terms of taxes, in terms of stimulus, in terms of approach, in terms of spending? Do you even get sucked up into that, or now you're going to let that play out and you don't get too worked up about it?
This is the way that I look at politics. I'm a basketball fan and you're a basketball fan. Speaking in basketball terms first, over the course of an NBA season, a referee might change the outcome of 1 or 2 or 3 games for your favorite team, right? But over the course of the season, the players, the coaches are going to dictate wins and losses. The same principle applies to who's sitting in the White House, where a president might affect a certain sector or company with policy, but over the course of a year, over the course of 4 years, the players, which in this case are investors, private capital, corporations, earnings, inflation, currency movements, geopolitics even, those things matter much, much, much more than who's sitting in the White House. People tend to focus on election outcomes and who's sitting in the White House and what it means for markets. And a perfect example on why this stuff doesn't make any sense to mix the two, back in 2016, Hillary Clinton was an 80% favorite to win the White House. Okay? That turned out to be wrong. And then they said, if Trump happens to win, the market's going to crash by 30%. That turned out to be wrong. Almost everybody was wrong. And I'm not saying that the market was up because of Trump or the market was down because of Trump or anything like that. But when you look and go back and read what people were saying in 2016 about what was going to happen with the election, and then if this happened with the election, the market's going to do this, that was the most egregious forecasting error that I've ever seen. And not to take anything away from that, but I think the message was, don't try to forecast this stuff, because emotion and politics and investing, all of these 3 things do not mix at all.
Yeah, I think I've heard you say it before, and I would tend to agree with it, that the president gets far too much credit when things go well, and they get far too much blame when things don't go well, and it really isn't a function of decisions they made or actions they took. I think that makes sense.
Well, and no matter what happens in November, half the country is going to be pissed off, and the other half of the country is going to be ecstatic. So you just kind of shrug your shoulders. You know, you've seen these cycles before, and then again, once the election is over, we'll all kind of move on. You know, when I talk to my wife and kids, you know, they're kind of paying attention, and their families are paying attention. My wife's family and my family are paying attention to the election. What I always go back to is what I do on a Tuesday at 9 o'clock doesn't change depending on who's in the White House. You know, people want to have these answers to these complex issues, and I think the answer is let's all do a little bit better. Let's all keep our side of the street clean and focus on yourself, your personal development, being a better spouse, being a better dad, being a better husband. Like, those are all things within my grasp that I can control. I feel like too many people get sucked into the vortex and things they can't control, and it doesn't do anyone any good.
You anticipate running for public office someday?
Absolutely not.
Because of your checkered past or something else?
I just couldn't deal with it. That seems like the worst dog and pony show that I could ever subject myself and my family to. I mean, even if I wanted to, I wouldn't do it because of my family. Like, you're putting them through the ringer just like you're putting yourself through the ringer.
Yeah, I've had the, fortune to work in school budget committees, school action committees, fundraising around schools, and they're a very necessary, obviously we all want to have good schools for our kids, and we all want them to have the resources that they need, but the process that you go through to get there was pretty eye-opening when I participated in them, and it made me not want for some of the same reasons you're suggesting.
Well, you seem like a pretty big committee guy. Like, you'd be thriving in that environment. Is that not true? Is that what you're saying?
This is a whole nother tangent, but you could basically, how do you work well in a group, I guess is the question. The answer is, as long as the group goes along with what I think we should do, I work great in a group. But a lot of times decisions were being made and actions were being taken that I just frankly didn't think made a lot of sense. And then it becomes difficult to participate in a committee, even though you've committed to do so, because you don't agree with the direction they're heading. So that part of it was challenging for me, but I don't mind being part of a team, and I don't need to lead the team. But, I'd like them to go in a sensible direction, even if it isn't always the direction I would.
I try to avoid committees like the plague, but there's always one that has an opinion on everything. That always wants to have the floor. It's okay to not have anything smart to say about a topic. That's fine. But some people just can't help themselves. And, there's an old saying that I always go back to. If you want the wrong answer, ask everybody.
Well, a quick anecdote, which you probably will cut out later, but I went in front of the school board because they were looking for people to participate on their budget committee. Finance guy, I like budgets. This is right up my alley. So the guy says, oh, you should really come and put your hat in the ring for the budget committee. And so I did. I wasn't working at the time, so I put my hat in the ring. And I went in, and they ask you questions, and you answer the questions. And what's your background? What's your qualifications? And I'm thinking, nobody's qualifications are going to stack up to mine. I've literally been doing budgeting for 10, 15 years. They bring up the next person, very nice person, asked her background and qualifications, run a bake sale at some point, and that was really the gist of her background. So any other questions from the committee? All right, we'd like to move ahead. And the person on the committee nominates the bake sale lady to be the person they go with. 4 other people second the nomination. All of them done. She's in, I'm out.
Wow.
And I was like, it's almost like they needed a second candidate so that it would look like a very balanced process. And I was the patsy, the old saying at a poker table, if you can't figure out who the patsy is, you're probably it. That night I was the patsy in the school board meeting.
Well, in a way, you actually won by not having to deal with those people.
What are you seeing in the market? What are you thinking about? Obviously, you write blog posts, but sometimes there's topics that don't make a blog post. What's caught your eye in the market lately? What are you thinking about today?
Well, I'm looking at small caps, And I believe it was last week or maybe the end of the week before, some divergences that are very historical and interesting. So last week, I'll say last week, I think it was last week, QQQ, the NASDAQ 30, so the 30 biggest tech stocks, was down about 6%. Okay, this has been a juggernaut over the past decade plus, the big 7 companies, AI themes, all that. Down 6%. Russell 2000, which is the U.S. small cap index, and by small, I mean, what is it? Companies less than 5 billion in market cap or something like that. So small with quotes around it, was up about 10%. Okay, so that's about 15% in 1 week. One of the biggest gap that I've heard of. And so I'm trying to think about what to make of that. And, a lot of people talk about rates, and I think rates are a big part of it. So when you zoom out and look at the borrowing cost for large companies versus small, large companies have limited access to capital markets. And rates went up in 2022 into 2023. That really didn't affect these large companies because they had locked in during the lower rate environment much of their borrowing costs. So a company, it's very responsible of them when rates are at historic lows to maybe borrow out 30 years, borrow up as much as you possibly can. So companies like Apple and Amazon were borrowing money even though they were flush with cash because the cost of capital was so low. Okay, so rates going up did not affect those companies. What it does affect is the smaller companies who have less access to capital markets, less access to borrowing markets. Much of their borrowing costs are variable. So when rates go up, they either have shorter term debt that they have to raise capital again at higher rates, or they have variable rate debt. Rates go up, their borrowing costs go up. Okay, so now, just looking at what the Fed futures markets are projecting, so there's markets out there that predict what the Fed is going to do next. There's almost 100% conviction in those markets that the Fed is going to cut in September. Okay, markets are sniffing this out. And if you say, I got this small company, $1 billion in market cap, and we're going to reduce their cost of capital, that could flow through to their profit margins. Those companies could go up in value. You throw in the fact that small cap is beaten down. A pretty good setup, a pretty good tailwind. So what I'm saying is that looks attractive. That move is pretty historical to see tech down 6%, Russell 2000 up 10%. And there's also a lot of smart investors out there that are starting to place bets in small cap, sniffing this out. We could potentially add to small cap on the 1st of August if the current trend and momentum rules hold. So that's what's really got my attention.
No, I think that's good. That makes sense. And if you look at performance, as you said, it isn't like small caps went past the Qs in terms of performance. It was just a little bit of a normalization, and they went from, historically undervalued, small caps did, to, slightly less historically undervalued. So the question is it the beginning of a move that's going to last for an extended period as we've seen in the past, or is it just a blip that happened and we'll go back to the regularly scheduled programming?
When we were walking to Chipotle, you mentioned that it was just a personal feeling, so this is not part of our investment process, but a personal feeling that the S&P has probably or potentially has seen the last of its gains for the rest of the year. So the second half of the year could be a little more difficult than the first. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I think, again, you and I both read quite a bit. We try to read as varied information as we can. A lot of the stuff I've been reading over the last 60 days is highlighting that certain macroeconomic factors are starting to weaken. And so the question that was off the radar screen for a period of time is now back, which is, are we headed for a recession? And if you look at the labor market, it's started to move in the wrong direction, so to speak. If you look at spending, if you look at debt, if you look at a number of different factors, consumer confidence, etc., they're starting to move in a direction that's unfavorable. So my comment to you was more, we had a pretty, as you said, remarkable run in the first half of the year, generally straight up with very little pullback, very little volatility. So my kind of working theory or thesis is, hey, we had a great first half of the year. If you double those numbers for the whole year, that's an amazing year. I think it's probably unlikely we get a doubling in the second half. So from my standpoint, maybe the first half was where we saw the majority of the gains this year, and maybe the second half will be a little bit tougher sledding. But as you said, that's just my opinion, and that's my, based on what I read, and we don't make our investment decisions, utilizing that.
Well, we're coming up on a period that has historically had some seasonal weakness. For the summer, people check out, lighter volume. It doesn't take much to move the markets. And then people will want to talk about the election. Now, there is empirical evidence to suggest before an election, markets do act a little squirrely. So that wouldn't be a surprise. And then back to my opening comment, I think a guy from Morgan Stanley came out and said, there's going to be a 10% correction this year. Well, if you go back 80 years, like I said, average intra-year correction is 10%. So that's like saying the sun is going to come up. So now's the time where people are going to be making all sorts of fear-mongering headlines about if X wins the election, this will happen, the market could sell off due to this. And again, they're just trying to get engagement. Markets are forward-looking. It's not a surprise an election's coming up. Markets are pricing all of that in. It's not like the market waits for an election outcome and then reacts. The markets are looking well ahead, which is why markets bounce back during recessions typically, because it's looking at brighter days ahead. So, I always like to remind people of that, because oftentimes the human mind can't draw that line. We're trying to draw a line between today's headline and market action. Markets don't work that way. It's like driving a car. When you're looking forward, that's the market. When you're looking in the rearview mirror, that's the economic data that just went 60 days.
Yep, makes sense. Hey, give us an update on Bitcoin. We haven't talked about it in a couple of calls. Just kind of talk about from your perspective and what your thoughts are on that as of today.
So Bitcoin's had a pretty good rally over the past couple weeks. And back to my comment about how politics can influence short-term trading, former President Trump is seen as a pro-digital asset president. So he was actually scheduled to speak in Nashville at the Global Bitcoin Conference. And he's come out and said that he's supportive of blockchain and digital asset technology, Bitcoin being a big part of that. As he's surged ahead in early polling, markets have tended to sniff that out. Bitcoin has went up, about 10 to 15%. But Bitcoin has been choppy. I mean, post-launch, it was up like 15%. I think in June it was down 10%, and now it's back up. So it's acting how you would expect. What I'm liking about Bitcoin, I think on Friday of this past week, what was that, the 19th, pretty much every market was down. Small cap, foreign, large cap. Bitcoin was up 6%. So when you look at portfolio construction and asset classes that act differently, Bitcoin is acting differently. And of course today, again, July 23rd, first day that Ethereum ETFs can trade. So I think what we're seeing is a more expedited acceptance of digital assets in both private capital, public institutions, and politics, which in my lifetime, I never thought that Bitcoin or any digital asset would be adopted by a politician. It could be diving for loose votes or whatever you want to call it, but I think the adoption part has come a lot quicker than I expected, which is a welcome thing to see.
Good. Yeah, I think it's been interesting to follow, but to your point, it's kind of done what we've communicated that it would do. It would have wild swings. That's why we sized it appropriately, very small part of the portfolio. But, generally the trend has been stronger. But again, it's a pretty relatively small part of the portfolio.
Okay, we're coming up on 22 minutes. It's my turn to ask some questions. You ready?
I'm ready.
What's your least favorite asset class?
Least favorite asset class? I'm probably going to say Bitcoin. I'm talking about the asset classes that we invest in. I don't know if that was your question or not. And the reason is because I've read some about Bitcoin. I haven't read as much as you. I've tried to do, my due diligence along with what we've done here at Pure. But I'd be lying if I said I completely understand Bitcoin, digital currency, cryptocurrency. So I don't like things that I can't wrap my head around. So I would say it's the asset class I'm most uncomfortable with. I'm still in favor of including it in portfolios because I do recognize the characteristics it brings to the overall allocation. But I would say it's the one asset class I'm least comfortable in.
So what if I tell you that many people smarter than I consider Bitcoin to be the digital gold. Like, that's what they call it. Digital gold.
My counter to that would be, why would you need digital gold? We have gold. Why wouldn't you just buy gold? And gold has done very well the last couple of years. So that's why I tend to lean more on the gold side of that equation. But I certainly understand the merits of Bitcoin and the digital gold. I always get a kick out of when they show a picture. You can't show a picture of Bitcoin. It's zeros and ones. But what do they show? They show a gold coin with some sort of a cryptocurrency moniker, Bitcoin moniker on it. So that makes me feel better about gold.
Well, that's probably part of why humans refer to Bitcoin as digital gold. We've been propagated or propaganded to think and associate Bitcoin with gold. Okay, second question. What's an odd quirk that you have? It could be a work quirk. It could be a personal quirk.
Why do you ask me these things on camera? What is a quirk that I have? I would say that I can be a bit controlling. How about that? I like to do things a certain way. That's true for a lot of people. But I'll give you an example. When we plan a trip, or we plan a golf trip, or we plan something, I prefer to plan it because I like to control the variables of the trip, and I like the trip to be done the way that I want to do it, even though it'd be a lot easier just on the golf trip to send in your check and show up at the time they said and just kind of go with it. I'd rather have more control over the situation, and that's kind of a good example of my mindset.
Hold on, I have a follow-up question. So, It's fine to want control, but are you open to feedback? If someone on your golf trip, let's say, says, "Hey, Toby, maybe not that course. Let's try this course. I've heard it's much better." Are you open to changing?
Yeah, I'm open to feedback up to a point.
Okay.
You know, if they're like, "Hey, you can get rid of the way you did it and do it this other way," like, okay, that doesn't work. But if they say, "Hey, what about there was a lot of driving on this golf trip, or some of the courses we played were too easy, too hard," whatever the case may be, you know, I'm open to that type of feedback as long as it's within the, you know, constraints of what I'm trying to do. How about you? What's a quirk that you have that you'd prefer not to say on camera, but now you're going to have to?
I'm kind of a quirky person, and my wife would testify to that. So when I'm microwaving something, I never let it beep. I don't like beeps. So, you know, I'm putting something in the microwave for 30 seconds, or, you know, it could be, you know, 15 minutes, and I'll stand there and wait because I really don't like the beep. So I'll usually stop it on a random number just so I don't have to hear the beep.
Now I feel better about mine.
Yeah, you should feel better. I don't like doors slamming. I don't like loud noises. I don't like light in my face 30 minutes before I go to bed. I'm very regimented in my routine. Like I try to get to bed at 8:30, in bed reading. If anything deviates me from that, I get upset. I get hangry. I have to eat all the time. I try to eat a lot. I eat more than I probably should. I hate traffic. I'll do anything to avoid traffic. I hate waiting in lines. I'm very impatient. So I'll do nonsensical stuff to avoid waiting in line. Like, I just want to keep moving and making progress. I don't know if
nothing wrong with
things or what, but that's just the way I operate. My wife thinks I'm like just over the top, but she's really laid back, so I think we make a really good team.
No, I think that's good. And next time, maybe we'll ask each other to identify a quirk in the other person. So you can identify a quirk that you've noticed about me, and I'll identify one for you as well. I have one final question before we wrap up. What is a conspiracy theory that you've come across that you actually believe could be true? What is something that you can't completely dismiss that would correctly be labeled as a conspiracy theory?
Wow, talk about entrapment. Okay, so I'm not going to get specific, but there's something rotten going on in this country. Like, look at the Boeing case. Boeing airplane door blowing out. There's whistleblowers that suddenly, before they're testifying, during their testimony, just turn up dead. What is going on in this country? There seems to be some underbelly that's evil, and I don't even want to, like, I'm not going to waste any time going down the rabbit holes, but it just doesn't smell right. It just doesn't sit right, and there's too many coincidences. And I think part of it is You give everybody a microphone on social media, and again, I always talk about engagement and eyeballs. Like, the more outlandish conspiracy theory stuff you spew, the more you can monetize whatever channel you're operating on. But something does smell, and I guess I'll leave it there.
I think that's fair. It seems like stuff happens and you go, that just doesn't pass the smell test. That isn't plausible. Or why don't we know more about what happened to those individuals in the Boeing case? I think that's a good way to say it.
Okay, we're up at 30 minutes. Happy half hour with Nik and Toby. Thanks for tuning in. If you have anything that you want us to cover, any topics you want to discuss, an asset class, a headline, feel free to shoot a note to insight@peerportfolios.com. We will see you all in August. Have a good summer.